My day job, as he said, sees me working as project manager in the Spatial Information branch of the Department of Resources. This is the most recent iteration of the Land Department, which was established in 1866. I find it easiest to just tell people that I work for the Mapping Department. My project is indeed the Cadastre and Address Modernisation, or CAM project, which is a 30 years overdue modernisation of, or a transformation of the systems and processes that we use to manage and maintain spatial cadastre, i.e. land boundary, and location addressing data. I don't doubt that this has been talked about before and that you're all familiar with it, but for the sake of our common understanding, I'll quickly go over foundation spatial data. We can organise information in 5 ways: location, alphabet, time, category, and hierarchy, or latch. Perhaps just 2, location and time, since alphabets, categories, and hierarchies carry no intrinsic meaning and can only be understood when represented spatially. And we could probably also argue that the unavoidable linearity of time makes it spatial as well, but we'll go with latch. Everything that exists somewhere, and everything that happens in a place. And even if it's no longer exists and is no longer happening, it once existed or was happening somewhere. We make sense of this information by organising and contextualising it spatially. You cannot have alphabetical geography because alphabets are conceptual and geographies are material. That said, Australia organises its spatial information into 14 categories, which can be put in alphabetical order or have numbers assigned. Furthermore, 4 of them were introduced only quite recently, so there's a time element as well. But collectively, they're known as the Foundation Spatial Data Framework, or FSDF. Cadastre and addressing are 2 of the categories. These are all themes of critical human geography, but are based on the United Nations' global fundamental geospatial data themes, and they were ratified by the Australia-New Zealand Land Information Council, or ANZLIC. ANZLIC was established in 1986 by agreement between the then Prime Minister Bob Hawke and the heads of all state and territory governments, with the notable exception of Queensland's then Premier, John Bjelke-Petersen, who wrote, or Joe Bjelke-Petersen rather, who wrote to the Prime Minister saying that he didn't see the point. In 1986, he presumably had other matters requiring his attention. FSDF data provide us with a shared and agreed understanding of material context. Foundation means from the bottom, and it's the thing on which other things, in this case our understanding, is built. Nothing on Earth happens outside its geography. Even thought occurs in a location. Geospatial, thus, is the foundation of shared human understanding of things and events on Earth. That didn't work. At this point, it's important to come clean. I have no background in geography, nor am I here as a representative of the state government, my department, or the managers and maintainers of data within that government and department. Instead, I'm here as the quirky pinko professor who the Dean and University Board long ago wanted to put out to pasture and then shoot from a distance, but I'm too popular with the rest of the faculty because I can get them cheap tobacco. I'm relatively informed about spatial cadastres, however, having worked in and around them for about 7 years now, and I hope I have some insight that will be of utility of interest to all of you gathered here tonight. But I'm not an academic, I'm not making any truth claims, and I'm also going to be really self-indulgent. I also apologise if you were looking forward to learning more about fire ants tonight. But I'll try and make this talk at least as spicy and pestilential. The topic this evening is Cadastre of the Commons, a historico-spatial materialist overview. I called it that, frankly, because I've always wanted to call something like that. And it's important that lefties like me continue to use language as an obstacle to broader understanding and engagement. It could just as easily be called a people's history. You may have also noticed the principal contradiction in the title. How can one have a cadastre, that is an apparatus of private ownership, for a public resource like the Commons? You can't, and that's why it's such a good title, because it's got drama in it. To begin with, we should get on an agreed datum. Firstly, materialism. Materialism is one of what are ultimately the only two schools or categories of philosophical thought, materialism and idealism. In our daily activities, we do not distrust the real, i.e. material, nature of our environment. We understand that the material, i.e. spatial world, exists independent of our reasoning about it. This spatiality is instinctive. Newborns naturally grasp for and latch onto material objects. The grasp reflex, as this is known, is an example of spontaneous materialism. Spatiality is not something that we have to think about consciously to act on. It's a biological imperative. The grasp reflex, for example, ensures that we clutch the branch. As we mature and begin to understand and recursively think about our own thoughts, some of us continue to accept that materiality is primary and that thoughts are products of our material brains, properties of matter, i.e. that being is dominant over thinking. So we remain materialists. Others amongst us may decide that no, thinking is dominant over being. The spatial world is in fact a product of thought, and thought is the foundation of all things and furthermore exists outside and beyond all things. In the beginning was the word, not the world. So we become idealists. Idealism in the philosophical sense is not the same as idealism in the sense of high-minded or optimistic. Arthur Schopenhauer, notoriously one of the most miserable bastards to have ever lived, was an idealist. Monism or monism is unification, and it's a third substance, mental, physical, or mind matter. Dualism is centrism or pragmatism or both sidesism, whatever you prefer. The famous Aristotelian Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, patron saint of geographers, was a dualist, which as a Dominican friar, he of course had to be. There is a difference between being a materialist and being materialistic. One can easily be a materialistic idealist. There is also a difference between idealism and ideology or ideology. One can be an ideological materialist. We needn't go much further than that, but I will note that nobody is born a spontaneous idealist, dualist, or monist. This is where I'm probably going to lose some of you. Historical materialism is the simple fact, hitherto concealed by an overgrowth of ideology, that humankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter and clothing before it can pursue politics, science, art, religion, etc. That therefore the production of the immediate material means, and consequently the degree of economic development attained by a given people or during a given epoch, from the foundation upon which the state institutions, the legal conceptions, art, and even the ideas on religion of the people concerned have been evolved, and in the light of which they must therefore be explained instead of vice versa, as has hitherto been the case. Now, this is Frederick Engels talking at the graveside of Karl Marx in, I guess, in 1883. If Karl hadn't already been dead, I think at the end of that, he certainly would have been. History is change. And with human history, those changes come about from our recognizing our ability to reconfigure the world to better procure the means of life. Historical materialism is not the hitherto bourgeois trickle-down propaganda of great people and their great discoveries and creations, which we have been mithridated with since birth. Instead, it is a recognition of history as a series of contradictions and qualitative and quantitative changes and negations and sublations that have emanated from the people and from the ground up. Our spatial understanding is from the ground up, and our reconfigured world is reconfigured from its foundations. No great explorer discovered geography. No queen or king is the prime mover of history. No skyscraper is built from the spire. Aristocrats do not clear the stones. Presidents do not furrow the fields. Popes do not irrigate them. Emperors do not sow the seeds. Queens do not sweat at the reaping of the harvest. The generals do not thresh. And the technocrats do not grind, despite claiming to do so on their LinkedIn profiles. How are they the instigators of history when they cannot even assemble the raw materials to make bread? We should repudiate these histories entirely and recognize them as poisonous, for they sterilize, stifle, and stagnate the revolutionary potentials in all of us. Young minds absorb this stained, perverse undermining of history and are paralyzed in the face of it. What am I to do in the shadow of all these great men and women and institutions? I, a mere geographical lecturer or lecturee. Geography is the shared foundation on which humankind labours. Labour is the manipulation of that geography so that we might better procure the means of life. That foundational reconfiguration performed by the workers is the forge of history. I'll now finally start talking about geography, this geography talk. Our second datum point is the cadastre. A cadastre is a state-managed gazette of property in the sense of private or what they call real property and not personal property. You don't need to read all of these, but it gives an example of where the term cadastre came from. Basically means something that's read from top to bottom. Modern cadastres have two components. The first is a register of title. That is a document describing the particulars of a property and the details of its ownership. By the strictest etymological definition, that is all a cadastre is, a titles register. Probably the most recognisable implementation of something like a titles register is the Book of Winchester, otherwise known
get that on now, I'm sorry.
as
No, but down there it was louder than
Yes.
on the table.
An even earlier example, about 5 centuries earlier, can be found in the cadastre of the Egyptian village of Aphrodito. Both were registers of allegedly owned land, who allegedly owned it, and how that alleged ownership came about, who lived there, what the land had on it, and what it was used for, and most importantly, how much tax the state could extract from it. This tax was, of course, primarily funneled into war machines, used to appropriate more land, since all wars are property wars, then and now. Neither the Aphrodito cadastre nor the Book of Winchester contain any drawings, maps, or survey plans. However, graphical representations of land boundaries are the second component of more recent cadastres. Now, from now on, I'm going to mainly ignore the matter of titles and deeds and records of ownership as separate components. They're kind of bourgeois ephemera that aren't spatial, other than the fact that you read them from top to bottom. A graphical cadastre either contains details of the title or references its existence or implies some knowledge of it. So from now on, we'll just say that cadastre, meaning both things, while only showing one of them. Pedantry is precision that does not improve clarity. Cadastre has a fiscal function, for it identifies properties and owners and enables their taxation. It has a juridical function, for it provides the legal record of ownership, boundaries, and rights, restrictions, and responsibilities associated with the parcel. That is what you can, must, and must not do to and on the land. Finally, it has a multi-purpose function, which can mean anything, but usually means it's used for development planning. Multiple individual cadastral survey plans for the same area are assembled into a cadastral map. There's 2 fine examples here that show what we now call the spatial cadastre. They show the dimension, size, definition, shape, disposition, relation to others, and delineation, separation from others, of units of land that have been divided into parcels via the act of surveying. If one takes a broad enough view with a specific enough lens, history becomes horoscopic. You detect patterns and derive meanings that do not exist or are tenuous at best. The history of the cadastre is like a Mondrian abstract put through a free online image filter that still required my email address. The history of the cadastre becomes like a cadastre itself over time. The ground moves and the fences collapse, the monuments crumble, the boundaries, already without width, since all they do is separate one thing from another, become fuzzy. The title claim of one property contradicts that of the next. A tree growing on one parcel drops fruit in another. So while what I've done is perhaps more entrail reading than research, it has revealed some inferences, some themes that in the spirit of Kant's conception of public reasoning, I think are worth exploring. Pardon me for a second. The earliest so far discovered evidence of metrology and symbols of measurement applied to land comes from Mesopotamia about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. The Sumerian pantheon was big on land administration. with the wind god Enlil somehow responsible for manifesting the mattock, one of the first earliest tools of planned agriculture. They also loved surveying, and it's likely that the rod and ring symbol of the ancient Sumerian gods and rulers, and specifically the sun god Shamash, is in fact a measuring rod and a coil of measuring rope. Despite gods being notoriously childish, there's nothing in the literature about them giving us quoits. The gods, of course, had no use for surveying, as they had created the world and thus knew its dimensions, definition, disposition, and delineation. Nevertheless, Shamash delivered land metrology to, unsurprisingly, the earthly rulers or nobles, so that those nobles could be equipped with the instruments of justice and truth. Thus, they were provided a base 60 or sexagesimal system of metrology. The first rule of sexagesimal metrology is that it's easier to tell people from the gods than it is to explain it, or indeed even to say it. Of course, what actually happened 5,000 years ago is some bootlicker with a stylus, having developed an accurate method for calculating the area of a parcel of land, would have presented it to Namu or whoever, seeking that king's favour. For a simultaneous benediction from the gods to the aristocracy was the concept of taxation, about 1,000 years before the invention of money. Our tax to the king was to be the tithe, 1/10 of whatever we produced. Immediately, the king's retinue set about applying these manna to the measurement of plots of land using the infamous kush or cubit, about 1/2 metre. Surveyors employed a pagan rope for this kind of work. Much later, the Greeks called these surveyors harpedonopti, rope stretchers. If we had no land of our own and were merely labourers, our tithe was the burden, delicately modernised to the corvée, a period of forced labour, i.e. slavery. If we were lucky, this labour would be tilling the king's fields, or digging silt out of his waterways, or building his walls. If we were less lucky, we did military service. Any wonder then that the objective of so many of us is to become owners rather than labourers. Better to pay in grain than in blood, and even better to use the blood of the worker to grow that grain. This is SI 427, a clay tablet found near Babylon, dated anywhere between 1900 and 1600 BC. The SI is short for Sipar, meaning that this tablet is the 427th artefact discovered, catalogued, and stolen by the West in an 1894 archaeological expedition to the ruins of the city of Sipar in today's Iraq. It depicts the first known land survey, and it uses a geometry of lines which is not intrinsically concerned with angles. Angles are a side effect of lines connecting to points to create a closed shape. A closed plane shape rather, is called a polygon because it can have any number of sides. If you know the length of the sides of a polygon, you can mensurate, i.e. calculate, the area within. Another tablet, Plimpton 322, appropriated from around the same place at around the same time and dated to around the same epoch, is a trigonometric triangle measuring table. It depicts what we now know as Pythagorean triples, providing the measurement of the short side and the measurement of the diagonal. That only sounds like two things to me, but I'd trust Pythagoras to know if he's got three of something or not. It has been hypothesised by an Australian mathematician, Dr. Daniel Mansfield from the University of New South Wales, that tablets like Plimpton 322 could have been used by surveyors to compute boundaries. Once you have a short side and a diagonal, you can close the polygon with a third line and end up with a perfectly right-angled triangle. Two of those spooning head to toe gives you a rectangle. Fields tend to be planted in rectangles because it's easier to sow, irrigate, weed, tend, harvest crops in fewer long rows than in many short rows. You can also plant a nice long line of trees to protect your crop from the prevailing winds. The Mesopotamians, you'll be interested to know, also practiced crop rotation, so all the grain's got a turn. Field plans were likely made out just before harvest, and they derived the boundaries from the surface area of the field. Even today, fields don't happen perfectly geometrically. So boundary derivation took non-Euclidean space and Euclideanized it or Euclideanated it which is pretty clever that these anonymous Middle Easterners were doing geometry and trigonometry long before those great European men, Euclid and Pythagoras, invented them. Knowing the area of the field means that you know what your tithe is, or more accurately, that the king knows what your tithe is. A farmer intuitively knows how much grain they have, but they would be reluctant to provide a true reckoning. My point is that the ancient representations of what we now call the spatial cadastre show polygons that are trapezoids or can be otherwise divided into triangles using proto-trigonometry. Base 60 is exactly what you want to use when you're working with polygons. With base 10, if you divide by 3, you get 3 and 1 left over, which is great at tax time, but not for the collector. Base 60 continues to be used today for high precision metrology, time, angles, and geographic coordinates. That's why we have 360 degrees rather than 100 or 1000. These ancient surveys, festooned with symbology and naturally precise shapes and angles scribed in clay, created an entirely new edifice in Victor Hugo's sense of Notre Dame being both a monument and an instruction between the rulers and the ruled. The tablets became artifacts of what Michel Foucault called power knowledge, which is a process, decree, instrument, or machination used by those who wish to rule. Imagine yourself as an illiterate barley farmer or goat herder in Babylon 5,000 years ago. I can say illiterate fairly safely, not because those ancestors lacked the capability, but because along with taxation and triangles, a third thing invented around the same time, around the same place, was writing. Literacy and being lettered is itself a form of power knowledge and is not something the bourgeoisie was interested in the proletariat possessing. At this early stage, letters and numbers simply hadn't had the chance to spread. They were the intellectual property, the power knowledge of the rulers. When the rope stretchers and scribes descend on your farm and say they represent the king, you listen because the king is favoured by the gods, else he would not be king. They roam about your land, performing a ritual of patterns with ropes and rods, scratching strange symbols in wet clay, and take their leave. Days later, more envoys return, this time tax collectors and soldiers. They bear hardened tablets with the same strange symbols you saw, and say that these symbols were given to the king by the gods, and that the ritual of patterns allowed them to divine the justice and truth from the very spirit of the soil, and that the scribes recorded these truths, and the truths say that this is what you now owe in silver or beans or barley or goats or daughters or the sweat from your own brow. You see, it's all written down here if you'd care to verify it. If you disagree, these soldiers will escort you before the court to plead your case. This process, repeated often and widely enough, or drilled into you in school as you sit quietly at your desks in orderly lines, or chanted at you in the cathedral, voids your ability to argue and to reason. Pretty soon the administrators, tax collectors, and soldiers are unnecessary, for the tablet implies them. Eventually, even the implication is unnecessary, for we are now simply a people who obey the tablet itself. That is power knowledge. Skipping over a few thousand years, not much happened, brings us to the Roman Empire. Romans cadastrated land using a process called centuriation. Roman imperialism caused a lot of we today call economic activity, which is growth without regard for consequences. The Romans covered vast distances and appropriated a lot of land very quickly and moved their armies around constantly to protect it. Two things were therefore of key importance: systems of spatial organisation that could be rapidly deployed and uniformity in their design. After conquering a new area, the Romans would first build a castra or castrum, a military fort. No surprise they were called that. Castration means subjugation. At the gromma or centre, castra, the grommatici, the one who carries the gromma or surveying rod, would plant their gromma, surveying rod, and with the blessing of the soothsayers, commence the ritual of centuriation. The grommatici, better known as an agrimensor, or land measurer, i.e. surveyor, was a member of the military but was an immune, meaning they didn't have to engage in combat. Centuriation begins with the creation of the primary east-west axis, or decimanus maximus, following the path of the sun. Then intersecting with that at the north-south axis, following the axis of the Earth, is the cardo maximus. These two maximi would then form the main streets. You scratch out the boundaries of the forum nearby. The general has his tent, his base, pitched at the intersection of lines, and the rest of the army arrays itself in a well understood and perfectly replicable manner around this centre. Beyond the castra, the agrimensors would use the baselines to create property grids of about 730 metres per side, called centuria, which could be perfectly subdivided into 100 parcels of land, called heridium, which were then given to colonist families to work, provided the previous freeholders had been suitably dispersed. We know they did this and the way they did it because the Romans left us physical cadastres, like the Cadastre of Orange, France, as well as information on their methods, which were first collected in the corpuses of the 16th century. Centurionation is an early example of what architect Keller Easterling calls a spatial product, or a repeatable formula for space. Rather than the bespoke observations required for differently sized Babylonian grain fields, you start from a tabula rasa and deploy dozens or hundreds of identical polygons across the landscape in a perfect grid, paying no heed to topography. And I allocate each polygon directly to a title holder. You know the precise disposition of the heridium thanks to the XY axes created by the decimanus and cardo maximus, and you apply an identical management regime to them all. In a few years, your armies have advanced and have at their backs a new tax base, new supplies, new reinforcement lines thanks to the infrastructure that was built connecting one castrum to the next, and new legions of strong, tanned, smooth-skinned, mostly naked young men ready to feed into your endless war machine. These new centurions, comfortable and familiar with the layout of their hometown, can be dragged and dropped to the frontier castrum and be immediately oriented. Weyland-Yutani would have used this Roman centuriation in creation of their shake and bake off-world colonies in the horrifying neoliberal future of the Alien movies. The Romans centuriated so hard and so fast that the agrimensors ran into each other. I apologise for the quality of this image, but I thought it was incredible. These have both been surveyed from a single baseline, and it was done so rapidly because of the ability, the spatial productness of it, that the surveyors bumped into one another and had to do a bunch of mucking around at the intersection. Centuriated land was often allocated to veteran centurions at the end of their service to the empire, as depicted in the documentary Gladiator, which follows Commander Maximus Decimus Meridius, who also sounds like a road, as he adjusts to civilian life. I'd love to be able to say that centurions are called centurions because they're allocated centuriated land, but that's not how it works out. It's just because the Romans use base 10, and when all you've got is base 10, everything looks like something that can be centuriated. As the Romans conquered east and west, centuriating new territory, they literally weaponized power knowledge, castrating the peoples of what we now know as Europe, Africa, and the Middle East from their land. Rome's centurions were certainly their vanguard, but they consolidated with centuriation, creating wholly imaginary grids over land they now fancied was theirs, and which they certainly defended as though it was. The farthest edge of the line of centuriation, closest to the enemy, called the Porta Praetoria, would soon have been clearly delineated with spilled blood, seeping into and across the earth, forming a new and terrible spatial product. The edge would have deepened in the minds of those on each side of it until it was no longer merely a boundary, a line without width, but something you had to physically pass through to get to the other side, a border. Karl Marx is often associated with the term primitive accumulation, which is a capitalist apologist's way of saying that before industrialization, all land was equally well positioned and equally fertile, all had the same deposits of ore and valuable minerals, the same proportions of fresh waters busy with fish, dozens of fat rabbits disinclined to move, the same number of the same kinds and maturities of tree, all of it awash in milk and honey. And certain people just intrinsically had the foresight and self-discipline to accumulate the resources that they naturally happened across or generated on their equitable portions. They used only what was immediately needed to keep them presumably an hour from death and maintained the rest for the future. The rest of us just YOLO'd all our meat and drink away in debased, debauched, carefree orgies of gluttony and self-abuse. Primitive accumulation is synonymous with Max Weber's completely deranged idea of the Protestant work ethic, that methodical, godly, assiduous men magically accumulated wealth as a suppuration accumulates pus. But primitive accumulation, work ethic, and godliness didn't give no consideration to material conditions. Rather than promoting the notion, Marx in fact dismissed so-called primitive accumulation and had this to say about it. This primitive accumulation plays in political economy about the same part as original sin in theology. Adam bit the apple, and thereupon sin fell upon the human race. Its origin is supposed to be explained when it is told as an anecdote of the past. In times long gone, there were two sorts of people. One, the diligent, intelligent, and above all, frugal elite. The other, lazy rascals, spending their substance and more in riotous living. The legend of theological original sin tells us certainly how man came to be condemned to eat his bread in the sweat of his own brow. But the history of economic original sin reveals to us that there are people to whom this is by no means essential. Never mind. Thus it came to pass that the former sort accumulated wealth, and the latter sort had at last nothing to sell except their own skins. What actually happened, by the old man's reckoning, was an original expropriation, the separation of labourers from the geographical reconfigurations that were the product of their labour, both by material conditions, e.g. infertile soil or pestilence, or by the elite ruling classes using force of law or religion or arms. We had hints of this use of force in ancient Mesopotamia, where cadastral power knowledge was first prototyped, and then more broadly in the Roman Empire, where they did the proof of concept. Who here is familiar with the expression, the tragedy of the commons? Surely. What do we suppose is meant by it? Would anyone like to volunteer? That's fine. I used to think it meant, isn't it a shame we don't have forests and fields anymore because they were all bulldozed to make space for roads and parking lots? And from one perspective, it certainly is, because forests are very handy to discard busted tyres, stained mattresses, and plastic bags of dog excrement in. But on the other hand, did you know that not only do deserts not catch fire every couple of years, but they emit basically no carbon dioxide? Even our rivers are catching fire these days. In order to halt global warming, we must continue the good work we've been doing to ensure the complete desertification of our land masses. I don't actually mean that. What tragedy of the commons actually means, in its original sense, is that if we permit everyday, normal, sensible people like you and I to have shared access to natural geospatial phenomena like fields or forests or rivers, our alleged inherent selfishness, or our human nature, will result in some of us overexploiting that resource to the detriment of all others. One of us will drag net every single fish from the river. One of us will fell every single tree. Another will let his cows graze the field until it is utterly barren. It's quite an incredible assertion when you think about it, that in every human individual, they have all of human nature within them. The man who popularized this notion is Garrett Hardin, a white male American racist and eugenicist, all three of which are the same thing, but which three do I mean? In what today wouldn't get more than a half dozen hits as a blog post, but which in 1968 was an article in Science magazine with a then circulation of about 100,000, Hardin wrote about this tragedy while providing no evidence for his assertions, apart from the equally unsubstantiated work of one William Forster Lloyd, who was a white male British racist and a member of the Royal Society, and thus an imperialist, who based his ideas on Malthusianism. Hardin also missed the point completely because Lloyd was talking specifically about overgrazing, which occurred not because the peasantry and their subsistence herds, but because of the greed of rich landholders and the wool merchants, as described by Thomas More in his Utopia of 1516. Your sheep that were wont to be so meek and tame and so small eaters, now, as I hear say, be become so great devourers and so wild that they eat up and swallow down the very men themselves. Never mind that the commons, as a recognised and recognisable resource for the people, the commoners, had been worked for hundreds, if not thousands, of years before Hardin identified the tragedy of it, and it had been working perfectly well. The peasantry gathered up useful materials from the wastes, harvested fruits and herbs, collected firewood. Karl Marx had a lot to say about wood, you'd be interested to learn. Caught small game, grazed the one or two animals that they had for milk, or simply enjoyed the commons for its own sake. The people well understood the purpose and function of the commons and knew well not to overexploit it, lest they face the wrath of their fellows. Nevertheless, the non-angels, to use Hardin's term, would be sure to exploit it until the resource was devastated. Hardin's brilliant solution, he actually had two. The first was that to stop exploitation of common resources, those resources should be privately owned. Because if there's anybody who hates maximising profit, it's capitalists. The second solution, that members of the welfare state, and let's not kid ourselves, he meant brown and black people, should stop breeding. A document known as the Charter of the Forest, or Carta de Foresta, was sealed in 1217, right alongside the Great Charter, or Magna Carta. You probably heard of the Magna Carta and perhaps have a notion that it is in some way a foundational component of political democracy. In reality, it's a dozen extremely wealthy barons getting together to draw up 63 clauses to limit the power of the king, who at that time was King Henry III, aged 10. Magna Carta is almost wholly concerned with codifying liberty for free men, i.e. the barons and landholders, i.e. capitalists, with one clause for the church. The Charter of the Forest was, to my mind, the more historically vital document. Capitalism to me is a lot like rugby. It's entirely the domain and remit of thugs and bullies, and so things about it do not interest me. When William the Conqueror took the throne in 1066, he immediately declared vast swathes of territory to be royal forest, which in those days was not a tree-based biome, but a legal term meaning outside and off limits. This unilateral appropriation of territory went on with king after king. Indeed, the Domesday Book that we saw earlier in 1086 recorded just 25 royal forests, while in 1215, as the charters were being drafted, that number had grown to 143, and their spatial extent was about 1/3 of the total usable land mass. This afforestation was a means by which the Normans yoked the English, as the forest and its vert, vegetation, and venison, game, was exclusively for the disposal of the royal family. Trespass against it was punishable by, you guessed it, castration, but also blinding. The Charter of the Forest reversed this trend, forcing disafforestation and the return of the forest to the common weal. Thus, the forests were made again more accessible to the peasantry and propertyless, the rules around their use relaxed, and future encroachments monitored by regular perambulation or physical inspection. This is also known as beating the bounds, which is literally walking the perimeter of something, hitting spatial objects to build a mental map of the cadastre on foot. In the words of Guy Standing, what the Charter did was nothing less than provide a legal foundation for living by asserting the commoner's usufruct rights, which is the right to use the commons in a non-destructive manner, the right to subsistence on common land and water. It also asserted the right to reparation if the high and mighty encroached on the commons through commercialisation of its products, enclosure or encroachment. The Charter of the Forest also included a clause about the so-called lawing of domesticated dogs over a certain size. Lawing is a coward and bully's way of saying chopping a dog's front toes off with a chisel to stop them from hunting. The Charter didn't outlaw this barbaric practice, so it wasn't all vert and venison. Setting aside the small matter of codified animal torture, the general emancipatory spirit of the Charter was subjected to attempted exorcism from the moment it was written into law. As early as 1235, Henry III distilled it by permitting lords to enclose parts of their estates with a meaningless subclause that basically said, but not too much. In Scotland, the enclosures were called the clearances, which gives you a better mental picture of what they were on about. The enclosures, we must remember, were physical: hedgerows and stone walls and ditches preventing animals from grazing, and perambulations and other forms of meets and bounds, which were more representative. Edifices of power with their trespass punished severely. A castration then of the peasants and workers from the geography that they had manufactured. For 750 years, the Charter was under attack by the nobility and gave rise to many peasant and bourgeois revolutions and such political movements as the Levellers, who took their name from their habit of literally levelling the hedges and stone walls, and who, like all good leftists, on their formation, almost immediately schismed into the Levellers and the true Levellers, who later became known as the Diggers under Gerard Winstanley. Winstanley wrote in their manifesto, "In the beginning of time, the great creator reason made the earth to be a common treasury to preserve beasts, birds, fishes, and man, the Lord that was to govern this creation. For man had domination given to him over the beasts, birds, and fishes, but not one word was spoken in the beginning that one branch of mankind should rule over another. Thus, the work we are going about is this: to dig up George's Hill and the waste ground thereabouts, and to sow corn, and to eat our bread together by the sweat of our brows." And so they set up a digger colony on the hill, but it was a very short-lived experiment. From 1604, then, 5,200 separate bills of enclosure were passed, and about 16 actual parliamentary acts, and the Charter itself was formally revoked by Parliament in 1971. The only part of the Charter that hasn't been reversed and banned is the bit about cutting healthy parts off dogs. What's most interesting, though, and most relevant to our subject tonight, finally, are some of the new methods of power knowledge that were deployed alongside these physical enclosures. The Ordnance Survey, so called because its purpose was to figure out how best to fire artillery on people and places, is the British Mapping Department and began in 1791, prior to the rush of enclosure acts from 1845 to 1882. The first official Ordnance Survey map, the entirely new and accurate survey of the county of Kent from 1801, is a monumental contribution to human knowledge, a testament to the precision and skill of the cartographer, and an incredible work of art. That's not it, but it's still gorgeous. And it's from 1886, the 1886 survey of the town of Barton upon Humber, it might be Humber, in North Lincolnshire. It also clearly shows the effects of the enclosures. This is some closer detail of the same area. This and the Ordnance Survey maps are not strictly spatial cadastres. Enclosure maps, where they exist, normally the enclosure was simply described after the physical barriers were installed, their own specific thing, and were drawn by surveyors after an enclosure was awarded to a landholder. A prize indeed to assume ownership of part of our common heritage. They do, however, have the smell of cadastral maps too. They provide the new base and superstructures of symbology and meaning that the power knowledge of a cadastre requires. And they were certainly used for essentially identical purposes. James C. Scott, in Seeing Like a State, writes, "Thus, a state cadastral map created to designate taxable property holders does not merely describe a system of land tenure. It creates such a system through its ability to give its categories the force of law. The cadastre manifests its own purpose. It is one of the few phenomena that is both subject and object. that is, both knower and known. As a tool of the state, it functions both as the observer and the observed, and it's epistemically circular. The power knowledge of the cadastre is not that it is a true reckoning of material conditions on the ground, or that it encompasses all variables, but that derivation from it will have consequences. Therefore, we shall subscribe to the notion that it is a true reckoning, not out of genuine belief, but to avoid the consequences of disbelief. After enough time, the dialectics of de jure and de facto sublate into one thing, de rigueur. We learn that order is preferable to disorder, that the cadastre implies order and is therefore preferable, and that we should therefore adhere to it to maintain that order. I'm sorry to say that my hubris has gotten the better of me, as hubris is wont to do. I know the brochure mentioned digital twins, and we're barely out of the Middle Ages. In the event that an emergency speaker is needed in future, then the next time we can explore the Napoleonic cadastre, which is the model for modern paper-based cadastres, the idea of the state as the great homogenizer, the Thatcherization of cadastral maps in the 80s and 90s, turning them into computer-based market simulations, and simulacra, digital twins, and techno-feudalism. Thank you very much for your attention.